This is my first time reading a Brandon Sanderson book, let alone a high fantasy book. The only other high fantasy book or series I have read is Lord of the Rings. So I'm gonna take you on a journey, and that journey is gonna be me reading this book for the very first time. I'm gonna have honest reactions about the book, and we're gonna get into a lot of discussions about all of it. It's a dense book, and it is very lore-based, and it is very, very new to me. So let's start. First, impressions about this very big bad boy. So Lord of the Rings is the highest fantasy I have ever read, and though I love our Heavenly Father Tolkien, he is a lot. He's a lot. I love his books, but they're a lot. Which is usually why I tend to stick with low fantasy. It's hidden in our world, you can kind of drape it over modern scenarios. It's fun. You know, we have spell books, people have wands, or maybe use your hands to do spells and you learn it from a textbook, but it's still set in the modern world. But don't get me wrong, I definitely enjoy high fantasy, especially when it's in film and movies, since that's mostly what I've experienced from. Also, Lord of the Rings, they're my favorite films ever. So I do love high fantasy. As for reading it though, that is what's super new for me, and reading Lord of the Rings after watching the films was very helpful. But when you're creating a world from scratch and your magic and all that lore from scratch, it can be a bit overwhelming. It's like learning how to breathe again, like everything's different. But the book it's growing on me, but I just haven't fallen in love with it yet. What have I learned about the fantasy world that exists in The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson? A lot. Let's go ahead and start with the things that I'm enjoying. There's a few type of magical powers, if you will, in this book. I'm still learning them. But one specifically that sticks out to me is soul casters. They're really cool and they give me airbender vibes. It's this rare and secretive power that they use with gems that comes from the power of the Stormlight. And the Stormlight is kind of how like the rest of the world runs, but not everyone gets to use it. And I don't think many people even like let it be known that they have these powers. Jasna closed her eyes, pressing her hand against the fallen boulder. She raised her head, inhaling slowly. The stones on the back of her hand began to grow more fiercely, the smokestone in particular growing so bright it was difficult to look at it. Shallan held her breath. The only thing she dared do was blink, committing the scene to memory. For a long, extended moment, nothing happened. And then briefly, Shallan heard a sound, a low thrumming, like a distant group of voices humming together, a single pure note. Jasna's hand sank into the rock. The stone vanished. So it's very like energy-based. They can transform different elements into something else. So it kind of gives you like an elemental witch, which helps ground me in this high fantasy. The other thing that I'm really enjoying is there's these creatures called spren, S-P-R-E-N, and there's quite a few of them. One specifically is wind spren, and this particular wind spren that I have been learning about has been following one of our main characters, Kaladin. And the interesting thing that I've learned about this particular spren and about sprens in general is that they're more sentient creatures. They speak, they, mess around, joke, they have a very pixie vibe, but they are not intelligent, to the point that this wind spren actually calls Kaladin out by his name, and he's like, whoa, how do you know my name? Like, you're not supposed to have that high of intelligence. And a little bit later on in the book, he eventually asks the wind spren if they have a name. When she's in front of him, she disguises herself as like a very pretty woman, so I'll refer to her as a she, but it sounds like they're more like spirits from what's been described in the book. And she does eventually say that she has a name, and then she's like, oh, I also have a nickname. And she finds it odd that she is able to realize that she has a name, let alone a nickname. She's starting to like be aware of the fact that she's not supposed to know these things, and that it's weird that she's aware. He said nothing, causing the spren to pout. She floated up, hovering, though she had no wings, and looked him in the eyes. Kaladin, why must you ignore me? Kaladin started. What did you say? She smiled mischievously, then sprang away, her figure blurring into a long white ribbon of blue-white light. She shot between the bars, twisting and warping in the air like a spring of cloth caught in the wind, and darted between the wagon. Storm you, Kaladin said, leaping to his feet. Spirit, what did you say? Repeat that. Spren didn't use people's names. Spren weren't intelligent. The larger ones, like Wayne Spren or River Spren, could mimic voices and expressions, but they didn't actually think. They didn't. We also learn about another spren called Fear Spren, And these fear sprens actually pop out in the middle of a battle that Kaladin is taking place in. So we'll get into the characters in a bit, but Kaladin is a slave and he has been sold off to army where a war is going on, and he has to carry like this awful board. You know, like, have you ever seen Lord of the Rings when like the orcs come up and they like throw those big boards over Helm's Deep so they can like climb up and attack? Those are the boards they're carrying. And I never really thought about like who has to do that job and how awful it is, which I will get into later. Kaladin and these other soldiers are carrying these boards or ladders essentially finally into the battlefield. So Kaladin is fighting in the Alethi army. I can't remember who they're fighting against, the exact word. I'll put it right here for you guys. The other guys, which I guess are considered bad guys, we don't know that yet though. The Alethi has just been considered the good guys in the book from what I've read so far. And so the bad guys are shooting arrows down and they're killing all these poor guys who are mostly slaves. And as they're dying, the fear spren starts to come out of the board. It says it's like a violet sort of red smoky residue. So I'm sort of wondering, do these fear spren appear in times of need? Again, there's just these little hints that have been popping up, which is really interesting. So I'm curious then if this wind spren that has been following Kaladin for actually quite a while, as he's been on his journey, she's, you know, said to him like, why don't you try to escape again, and all these sorts of things. Is she trying to, you know, help him? Is she some sort of like, I don't know, fairy godmother? So I'm curious to learn more about those. Arrows struck the bridge in a wave, dropping half a dozen men, spraying blood across the dark wood. Fear spren, wiggling and violet, sprang up through the wood and wriggled in the air. The bridge lurched, growing much harder to push as they suddenly lost those men. And then the last thing about sort of the fantasy elements I'm enjoying, it's interesting how like these stormlight gems are essentially infused into everything in Brandon's world, to the point that like the currency that they use, it's like a clear sphere, and then there's different types of gemstones. I believe they said there was like diamond, emerald, and a couple different colors, and that's like the level of currency, and it's like how expensive they are. But they also use them like in chandeliers to light buildings. They kind of use it in everything. It literally like powers this world. So as for the characters, I've only met 2 so far. I know that there are potentially a couple more. We have a multiple point of view in this book. We don't ever stick with just one character throughout the whole story. And these characters also don't really interact. So far, the only connection that I have learned is either that maybe they are of a similar race or they're from a similar like city or country, and their stories are happening at the same time. But otherwise, that's kind of the only connection that they have. So far, we've met Shallan, and as I mentioned before, Kaladin. So Shallan, I really like her. So Shallan is really cool. I get a lot of very like Jane Austen-y vibes from her, and what I mean by that is she's very witty. She's very quick about her words. She has a sharp tongue, to the point that in this society, which I'll get into later, women are not supposed to speak out of turn. They're not supposed to have an attitude. They're not supposed to be, you know, very quippy and smart. But Shallan has brothers, and her brothers love her, and they don't really care. They like how she speaks out. They like what she says. And currently on her journey that she's been going through, she's been with a lot of sailors. So been able to kind of speak her mind more, and she's clever. I like her. So much so to the point that I'll touch on this a bit more. Shallan actually sees the captain reading a book, which is really odd because in this world, men are not taught how to read or write. That belongs to the women in society. Men are mostly taught how to read glyphs, and also more higher educated men technically read glyphs. So like lower class men might not even learn how to read them. And Shallan says that it makes her really uncomfortable when she sees the captain of the ship that she's been with reading, which is, I don't know, I guess it's kind of like a nice change versus the opposite of technically women like read back then, but that was sort of all they did. They couldn't learn like math or science. So I feel like it's kind of like a flip on that. And so our other character, Kaladin, I feel like I feel for Kaladin the most. He's been through a lot. He's first introduced as a captain for the Alethi, but later on I realized that yes, he was a captain for a section of the Alethi army. However, he was a slave, and he earned his way up to that point, and he was really proud of it because at least he felt like he could wake up in the morning and fight for something. But then I discovered that he actually killed 2 people that were his slavers, and he missed a 3rd person, which is why he's now a slave. And the other struggles that Kaladin has gone through is that while he's been on this journey and he's been trapped in sort of like this wagon with a bunch of other slaves and treated poorly and just he really liked being a warrior. He's tried to escape about 10 times now, to the point that he got branded with a glyph that essentially says he's a deserter. And that's the worst thing you can possibly do, so far what I've learned in the society, even though he's also a murderer and he calls himself that. But that's more okay than being a deserter, which I find really fascinating. But again, the people he did try to murder were people that enslaved him. More so specifically, in this world, if you have bright colored eyes, they could be bright blue, bright green, light brown, light gray. They just have to be a light of any color. Like me, I have brown eyes, but they're actually quite dark. So I'd be considered a dark eyes in the society, which means I would be lower. I'd be a lower class. If you have bright eyes, you are of a higher status. So like, for example, Shallan, she has bright eyes, and so they call her brightness. I feel like it's kind of his way of putting a spin on racism in his world, but it's through the form of eyes, because in this world, anyone of any race can have bright eyes, and that makes you have a hierarchy in society. So Kaladin hates bright eyes, and it's like his mission to kill them. He hates the way that society runs on this hierarchy. And also, this kind of hints on Brandon's writing a bit. When Kaladin is having to carry this ladder, it goes on for like 3 or 4 pages, and it sounds like one of the worst things possible to endure in your life. And the way that Brandon wrote it, I really felt like I could almost feel the pain and agony that Kaladin was going through. And Kaladin even says this is the worst thing he's ever had to do as a slave. I really do like Brandon's writing. I think he's very descriptive in explaining everything, and he gives a great voice to all of his characters.
The next hour was torture. It was worse than any beating he'd suffered as a slave, worse than any wound on the battlefield. There seemed to be no end to the march. Kaladin vaguely remembered seeing the permanent bridges back when he'd looked down on the plains from the slave cart. They connected the plateaus where the chasms were easiest to span, not where it would be most efficient for those traveling. That most often meant detours north or south before they could continue eastward. The bridgeman grumbled, cursed, groaned, then fell silent. They crossed bridge after bridge, plateau after plateau. Kaladin never got a good look at one of the chasms. He just kept running and running. He couldn't feel his feet any longer. He kept running. He knew somehow that if he stopped, he'd be beaten. He felt as if his shoulders had been rubbed to the bone. He tried counting steps, but he was too exhausted even for that. But he didn't stop running.
So to wrap up what I feel about the characters so far, even though Shallan is of a higher status of Kaladin due to their eye color, and she also comes from like a more well-off family, Shallan is in a tight position right now. Her father just died, and her brothers realize that their father has made a lot of bad promises, and he has a lot of debts that are unable to be paid off. And they actually discovered that he had a soul caster device, and it's called like a fabrial, and essentially they're able to lock the stones, the gems from the stormlight in there that gives them the power to do soul casting. So Shallan has discovered that this governess named Jasna, she is a soul caster. And so at first when you're reading this, you think that, great, Shallan wants to go work for her, she wants to be her companion, so that way she can earn some money. But we quickly realize that after Jasna has performed a soul casting ritual for her brother, who is a king in this particular area in the world that they're in, so she's pretty high up, that Shallan actually just wants to steal her fabrial. Now I have no idea if she wants to use it to be a soul caster or if she's trying to sell it off, but they definitely need money. But the point I'm trying to make is that if Shallan gets found out for what she's doing, she could be dropped to the bottom and turn into a slave just like Kaladin. And so her and Kaladin are willing to do whatever it takes to survive at this point. I definitely appreciate that Sanderson is showing that no matter where you are in life, sometimes things can get really hard and you get to your most desperate point possible and you're willing to do anything just to survive. Because Kaladin definitely has these moments where he's just like, I'm gonna lay here and die. Like after they go off to battle and he's brought the ladder out and all these men around him have died and now there's less of them and his body is aching and it's sore and he's bleeding and he just can't handle the pain anymore. He's almost willing to just like lie out there in the field and die, because by the time he would be able to leave and like go and find food or water, he would be dead from all those things. But he decides to get up again and he's gonna go back to the camp and continue being a slave. And it's interesting because he talks about all these moments of despair and what's the point and why bother, but then he mentions that occasionally he has hope. Him and Shallan are both on this journey of like, they have to make things work. For Kaladin, he has to stay alive no matter the horrible consequences or the pain and suffering that he goes through. And Shallan is willing to do whatever it takes to get this fabrial from Josna, who is a soul caster.
It was true. Josna really did have a functioning soulcaster, and a powerful one too. 9 out of the 10 soulcasters were capable of a few limited transformations, creating water or grain from stone, forming bland, single-roomed rock buildings out of air or cloth. A greater one, like Josna's, could effectuate any transformation, literally turn any substance into any other one. How it must grate on the Erdens that such a powerful holy relic was in the hands of someone outside of Erdentia, and it was a heretic no less.
My overall thoughts for this first video about how I'm feeling so far about the Way of Kings is that I really love that Brandon has made these very powerful women in society to the point that they're actually allowed to learn math and science. That's one of the things that Josna actually tests Shallan on when she's interviewing her to be her companion. And I think before like the 1920s, if women were like, I want to go to school and educate myself, usually the, response was, why? What's the point? What are you going to do with it? And it's funny because in the book, Shallan, before she goes off on this journey, before her father dies, she actually says,
though she dreamed often of traveling, she'd expected to spend her early life sequestered in her family's manor, only escaping through books of her father's library. She'd expected to marry one of her father's allies, and then spend the rest of her life sequestered in his manor. But expectations were like fine pottery. The harder you held them, the more likely they were to crack. She found herself breathless, clutching her leather-bound drawing pad to her chest as longshoremen pulled the ship into dock.
But it is interesting that even though women are very educated, they are still not allowed to speak out. They cannot have a curt tongue. They really have to watch their attitude, and they still have to be respectable women in society. So he's kind of playing like with this back and forth fine line between like giving women the power of knowledge, which then allows them to do a lot of things, but they still have to watch how they speak, which is why I like Josna, because she actually offends a lot of the religious community because she doesn't like them. She doesn't like what they do and how they view things in the world. And she's very smart, and she's very strict, and she's very harsh about who she takes on a companion, and it's almost like she doesn't have time for people in her life because she wants to be an intelligent, powerful woman. And lastly, the multiple point of view thing is just, at first it was a little hard for me to deal with because obviously when you get into a book, you just want to become attached to your characters. You want them to be involved with each other and have bonds. But I am definitely getting more used to jumping back and forth. At first it was jarring because I'd get attached to Kaladin, and then I'd go to Shallan and I'm like, who are you? Why do I have to care about your story? But now I've just kind of accepted the multiple point of view. And then as for the deep lore, I am a nerd and I play Dungeons & Dragons, and it's starting to grow on me because if you have a dungeon master and he's created a world from scratch, you love hearing about how they've built this world from top to bottom, how everything functions, whether it's from the currency to the magic, and how the houses are built and how society functions. So it's just a bit overwhelming at first, but as you start to guide yourself in, you're like, okay, I can dig this a little bit. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more of these, and please remember to subscribe and like this video, and also share this with any of your bookish friends out there who are high fantasy lovers, maybe low fantasy lovers, or anyone who's a Sanderson fan. This book has 1,000 pages in it, so we're definitely gonna be going on a ride for more of these.